to the Told on the Line podcast. I'm your host, Gio Grassi, and today I'm bringing you guys Ted Lambrinidis, who is a GPS genius. From when I first met Ted back in 2018, I hear you laughing, Ted. Ted has been around the strength and conditioning and basically the overall sports game for ages, decades. I mean, he might have been around when, sports was first created. Man, Ted's been doing GPS monitoring, strength and conditioning, coaching, and he's just developed great relationships with players and coaches around the country. Ted, thank you for coming on today, man.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on more than anything. So if you want to take some time, because I can guarantee you there's a lot of people who probably don't know you because you're more of a behind-the-scenes guy. If you want to just take some time and introduce yourself and let our listeners know where you've been, where you've come from, and how you've got into the role where you're at today.
Well, I played college football at the University of Dayton, and from there I transferred to the Ohio State University, and that was back in 1979. So you are correct, and I've been around for decades. And so when I got to Ohio State, they had an opening for, at that time, that was at the start of college strength coaches getting hired. Okay. And so they had a position open to help out in the weight room. So I went in, interviewed, and then I got hired. And so it was the head strength coach and myself running all the programs for all the Ohio State programs there. And it was a tremendous learning experience. So I completed my bachelor's degree at Ohio State and did my master's and the doctoral work there at Ohio State. And I had the opportunity to work with some really great coaches. The strength coach at the time was Steve Bliss. And the football coaches I got to work with were, Pete Carroll was an assistant. Nick Saban was an assistant. Mark D'Antonio was a GA with me. Jim Tressel was an assistant coach. Glenn Mason was an assistant coach. Dom Capers was an assistant coach.
Wow.
And then
Hall of Famers, man.
Yes. And so while I was there, through the exercise physiology department, we set up we did a beta project for a local high school where we went in and set up their high school program for them and coordinated it. And from that, they started a master's degree with an emphasis in strength and conditioning. Okay. So if you got into the master's program, you were assigned a high school. You were literally the high school strength coach. That high school paid for your education. And then you also helped out with training the Ohio State football program. So some of the strength coaches that came through that were, Mickey Marotti, Ken Manny, Rick Spielman, who's the general manager for the Minnesota Vikings, Sean Brown at West Virginia. Chip Morton was in the NFL for, 20 some years. And we just had, Mark Asanovich was an NFL strength coach for years. So it was really a great experience. So they got to be involved with the Ohio State program, get their education, and also the hands-on practical experience of running a high school program, really helped them become much better strength coaches. And then when I left Ohio State, I went to work for Pete Brown, who's one of the owners of the Cincinnati Bengals. So I did work with some of his private businesses and helped out with the Bengals. And then I was doing consulting. I was on the NCAA Speakers Bureau for, several years, and did a lot of consulting with, giving talks to college and professional teams. And then when the NFL started their tracking program about 6 years ago, I was involved to sort of serve as a consultant for teams to help them with the data interpretation of the information they were getting from their from the game day data, and then assisted teams with, some of the data they track during practices. So your theme today is, various technologies for tracking sports, where it sort of originated. And it's interesting. I read Pete Carroll was an assistant coach for Bud Grant at the Minnesota Vikings. And so when and Pete talked about one time the team was doing, back in the day, you do a warm-up lap to get loose before you stretched or did your calisthenics. Mm-hmm. And so the team's doing the warm-up lap, and, Pete Carroll's, BS with another coach, and Bud walks up and taps him and said, you might want to watch. You'll learn something. And so Pete said that, Bud told him, I watched the team warm up because I want to see how they look running. Do they look tight? Do they look gimpy? Are they talking? Do they look like they're overworked? So to me, that's observational sports science. This guy's doing observation, looking at how guys are running, what their gait looks like, how are they communicating. And he would make modifications on that particular day's practice plan based off what he saw during the warm-up.
Oh, wow.
So when you have, coaching intuition is really strong. Some may say that, that's, subjective feedback, which there was an interesting study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine a few years ago, looking at teams that were tracking objectively, say with a GPS technology versus using objective measures, which would be tracking training load via RPE times duration. So your relative perceived exertion. And in that particular study, they found both to be equally effective. So when I, read that about, Bud Grant, you go, those are the smart coaches. They have a sense of, and when you looked at where, tracking and monitoring athletes, that's how it was done for a long period of time. And coaches would put tremendous amount of time into practice design. They would look at, what drills they were doing. Are we doing these drills too frequently? Are the players getting bored? Are they getting stale? And they would look at over the course of the season how they would dictate, periodizing, or in that case would be how do we reduce training load as the season goes on? So to me, that was the art of coaching. And, certainly now with technology, you can really refine that to a greater degree.
Yeah. Now, real quick, fine tuning like player load as the season goes along, is that even possible? Is that even a thing, or is it just because from what I believe and what I think, and I think you and I had a conversation a while ago, like you have two players that play the same position. Let's just say wide receiver, for example. One guy might respond, better with a high quote unquote player load versus another player who might not respond as well with a high player load. Vice versa, low player load might be good for a guy. Low might not be good for, player B. Do you see that as well? Do you see that trend within, player tracking and stuff like that?
Oh, I think you have those differences. I think some of it, if you get guys that are real twitchy or they have a higher degree of, fast twitch muscle fibers.
Yeah.
Their training tolerance, might not be the same as somebody that is not quite as twitchy as them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that could be evident in some of their metrics that you look at the beginning of practice to the end of a practice. So there's obviously differences. I think the other thing that's crucial is when you're looking at player tracking data, you also have to, one of the problems I think in sports science is that we sometimes assume the player doesn't have a head.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at one college practice, and we're tracking, and a buddy of mine was he handled all the sports science for this particular team, and it was it's a Power 5 team.
Mm-hmm.
And so the practice is over, and the head coach comes over and says, "All right, tell me who worked hard." And I wanted to say, what the hell were you doing the last 2 hours?
Yeah.
I said, I could look at this data and tell you that this DB's numbers are unbelievably high, but he was out there like a chicken with his head chopped off because he's a freshman and has no idea what he's doing. I said, this player right here, whose numbers are significantly lower, is your best DB because he's the smartest. He doesn't have wasted movement. So I think anytime you're looking at numbers, you also have to overlay how are they actually performing.
Yeah.
And how do performance improvements alter some of the outputs that you see with some of the tracking. And if a guy becomes more efficient, some of those numbers should trend down because they're much more efficient. They have less wasted motion.
Yeah.
So I think those are things. I think some teams, when they put together their practice report, they'll have all the tracking metrics, but then they'll also include, how did this player practice today? And you could grade, give them a grade like you do on game day. How did they grade out from the practice? Because ultimately, that's what you're trying to do is you're trying to improve the performance of your position and it as a collective group, the execution of the game plan.
Yeah.
And so you want to look at the physical outputs, but you have to look at it within the framework of, hey, are we getting better? Are we just doing reps to do reps? Are we really executing at a much higher level?
Is there a true number, like a true objective number people should look at and say, all right, hey, a DB covers this much ground in a game? Or do you think like that type of stuff should vary between, the style of football people play or, the offenses people play or, playing against? Do you think that has a key thing as well? Or is it like, that's no true generic number, right?
Right. Yeah. You'd have to look at the style of play. That's a huge factor. And then you also look at some of these kids that are on every special team as well.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a high scoring game and you're on every special team, you're going to have really high numbers. And so what you try to do is, you look at, the tempo of the game, what's the average time of the play? What's the average time between plays? If I want to collect that data on my opponent. So as we're preparing for that week's practice, you want to getting used to the tempo that they're going to expect.
Yeah.
And so, little things like when you're in a team period, how do you substitute? Are the players behind the huddle, right behind? And this way, if you're doing a lot of substitutions, let's just say for your defensive linemen, they got to get used to running on and off the field.
Right, from the sideline, not behind the huddle, right?
Not behind the huddle. So get them on the sideline. When you're in a team period, you want to make sure that is as close to game speed and experience as possible. Because when you compare game outputs and practice outputs, you find a lot of players or teams, they don't practice hard enough. And so, you look at team and you're going, they're not running those routes like they're running them in a game.
Right.
So you get into the game and you wonder why their execution's a little bit off. The quarterback was late on the throw because this guy's busting his butt out of the break and running the route faster than he was in practice. So your timing's off. So you want to make sure that, and you can't do that every day of the week, obviously.
Right.
But you've got to have a certain number of plays that, that timing is done at a game speed. Yeah.
I think the one way we've used it, where I coach here at Fordham right now, our head strength coach, Joe Gilfeder, he kind of took all the data from, our first 2 years at Fordham. How long did we take between plays, distance covered and whatnot. And that's how we developed our conditioning program for our football guys. And I believe it's been, pretty essential. So that's one way we've used it. What are some other ways you've seen other people use it?
No, I think the way you're doing it's great because, that's the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. And then you can, the other thing that I'll look at will be, you want to look at game reps. And then I look at the guys that are second, third team. So when I look at the end of the week, what was the weekly training loads? So when I include game day, I look at my backups and go, these guys are about, 20% off the starters. So if our starter goes down the first series next week, this guy's going to be fatigued by the fourth quarter. So those backups, I've got to figure out a way to get them extra reps or extra conditioning to be prepared for that workload if it's called upon them.
Yeah.
So I want to look at differences between, at the end of the week, the differences in training loads between my starters and non-starters. And then also that gives you a great baseline to use for return to play protocols. Right. So, it's again, the last thing you want to do when you're bringing a kid back is, a guessing game. Well, we'll start them off at 50%. You go 50% of what? And then this way you can be real precise in terms of your distances, your change of directions, your velocities.
Gotcha. You have something to measure against what your 50%. Gotcha. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Because, a lot of, return to play is what they refer to as a swag. And that's a scientific wild ass guess.
I've never heard that before.
So you want to make sure, in this way, the kid has more confidence. And then if their parents ever call, you say, hey, this is what we're doing with your son.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to do it. I hear a lot of people talking about return to play, but I've never really understood how. Like, okay, you brought good light there. Just, have a good measurement of what 50% truly is from what they used to do, right? So their previous would be a baseline generally.
Right.
So, okay.
And then the other thing too is those numbers that you've collected are, especially now with this COVID return to play. And that is, hey, we know what the first week of training camp is going to look like. And what they want us to do now, if we look at the CSCC, NSCA resumption of training after a long layoff, starting at 50%, now you just work backwards. All right, here's where we're going to be when camp starts. So let's work backwards. We're going to be at 50% of that starting. So you've got guidelines or you've got measurables that give you your distances, your velocities, and then if you're working off, starting off at 50%, then you have a means of progression.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because, people go, we're going to do 50% of what? I go, this is where we got to be the first week of camp, and this is where we're going to be, and this is what the first week of, game week look like with the game.
Right.
So you have there's a stepwise progression to get there. And I think, that's the way, you want to make sure you use that for some of your planning.
Gotcha. Now, what do you think about outside of practices and conditioning? What do you think about, using this stuff with speed training and agility training? Do you think it serves purpose, or is it just waste of, not waste of data, but I guess like a waste of, time setting up and stuff like that?
Well, aside from, charging and putting in, you can probably quantify a little bit more what you're doing. Particularly, I think it's important when this summer's a little bit of an aberration, but normally you've got your workout template set up for your summer, and you've got, your strength training, your speed, agility, conditioning. But then you have player run practices of 7-on-7. For me, you go, well, what did they do? That's where I want guys tracked when they're out there on their own, because that becomes part of their chronic workload.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to modify chronic and acute workloads, I want to account for what they're doing when they're out there on their own.
It's interesting.
You could have a wideout that goes out there and runs 4,500 extra yards.
Yeah, unnoticed, right? Just doing his own thing, running some routes, right?
Exactly. So that gives you a means to have accountability for that. It's for the player's health and safety.
So, Ted, with what you do, being that you consult with all these teams, now I don't want to know what you specifically, have in these conversations with coaches and, maybe some GMs, but say you see something that's, pretty evident to you. Say, hey, this guy runs a slant route faster on the right side versus the left side. The timing is precise, X, Y, and Z. You get deep into the sports science that way. How do you create that conversation where you want the coach to somewhat listen? Because I want to say that not 9 out of 10 times, but there's a high percentage of the time where a coach is not going to change his practice, not going to change his packages on plays. What do you think is the safest way to approach a head coach or a coordinator and say, hey, look, this is what we see, this is what we believe, or not believe, but this is what we think might work better for your offense or defense?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Or do you just stay away from that? Hey, just keep that one in the back pocket and say, wow, this is interesting.
You know what? I may mention it to a position coach, but I'm not treading on a head coach or a coordinator.
Yeah, because they're not going to change the damn thing they do, right? They've been coaching forever. They got their style of whatever, whatnot.
No, you can look at some trends. From the data, you could say that, all right, this quarterback is taking, 2.85 seconds to release. All right. And then they're playing a team that gets pressure in 2.51 seconds. Now, not sacks, but pressure. You say, well, might want to do something a little different this week. You're going to, max protect, might want to do some reverses to keep those DNs honest. Might want to do maybe shotgun or just some 3-step drops, get the ball out quicker. And I saw that on one team like a couple years ago. and they didn't make any adjustments. And the quarterback got sacked like 11 times.
Oh boy.
So you're just seeing, you're going, well, wait a minute, this is what's coming this week. You've got to make some adjustments. But you know what most teams do. You can look at, wide receivers, the speed on different side of the field, how they run, press coverage, zone coverage. And then where do they have most of their drops? And there's some research coming out that, how you have, a right, left eye dominance. That probably plays a role because you can look at some guys and a lot of their drops come from one side of the field. And so you go, this guy, so those are some things I think that for assessments of teams you want to look at. Where's that quarterback throw? Where's he most accurate?
Yeah.
And, a lot of this, you look at, heat maps. I mean, one team a couple years ago, they were the best team defending 11 personnel, which is the most used personnel grouping in the league. So this one team, they had the best defense against 11 personnel. So if you look at, all right, boy, how do we get attack this team? So if you just look at where are most of the pass completions against this team? And if you looked at, well, you attack their linebackers. So, so don't beat your head against the door because they had some great lockdown corners. Attack their, take what they're going to give you.
Yeah, find a little weakness somewhere across the middle. If the outside's pretty much locked up, right?
Don't go into games saying, well, this is what we do.
Yeah.
Well, you can look at that. That's one way to look. The other way to look at it is what are they giving you?
Right. And that's kind of what I was thinking. It's like, hey, these coaches they're not going to change their game plan. It's like, hey, try to stop what we do. But like you said, hey, if they're giving you a little bit of cushion here, why not take it?
Yeah. I mean, there's an old saying in the military: if you defend everything, you defend nothing. So to me, that applies in the game of football too.
Yeah. Nice, man. Well, Ted, let's talk a little bit outside of football. If you've worked with, a baseball, soccer, or basketball program, what are some best practices for those sports with, their own type of GPS monitoring or, athlete monitoring outside of GPS stuff?
Yeah, I think, basketball is, well, the NBA, most of the tracking done in the NBA is done with video systems. They don't actually have a device on the athlete. And so does Major League Baseball. They'll use, the Comcast system. So it's all optical tracking. Okay. A lot of college basketball will use RFID technology or ultra wideband. Yeah, that's the most common, right? Yeah. So for basketball, that's excellent technology for tracking basketball. And the thing with basketball too is with that type of tracking, you can get a lot of different metrics in terms of how close was the defender to the shooter and what's the shooter's field goal percentage based off how close the defender is. Because you can sit there and look at scouting reports and say, if you're if you're at 3 feet, this kid hits 50%. If you're at 2.5 feet from him, he hits 38%. So you got to scoot up a little bit when you're defending him this week. Yeah. So, plus it gives you a real good idea in terms you can look at, how is your practice matching up with the demands of the game, what you had alluded to before. And I think that's excellent for because you find basketball coaches, they stop and talk too much during practice. Yeah. So when you compare the demands of the game versus demands of practice, and if I'm looking at tracking data and if I have heart rate being tracked too, I'm not seeing the sustained heart rate elevations in practice that I'm seeing in the game because there's too much stoppage. So the advice to coaches, I go, hey, I understand you got to get teaching and coaching in, but when we're in these two periods, try to use a game day coaching strategy. And that is, you got to coach why it's going on. So in these 2 periods, we get in this period, don't stop the flow.
And I never noticed that about basketball. Like, I know basketball has those periods where the coach just stops everything, coaches everyone up in the middle of the room. And I never thought, hey, where's the end game situation? Like you said, the heart rate, it starts to drop after a certain time. It's like, hey, coach, you got to keep it elevated. Keep these guys going, keep these guys moving. That's awesome.
Yeah. And I think soccer is a great sport to utilize, the tracking, because it gives you a great idea of, not only for tactical purposes, but for, the physiological differences and positional. And then you can look at trends of how did this, what are the movement demands when the game's tied, if you're ahead or you're playing from behind. Because once you have there's enough historical data to look at that, and then that gives you a better idea of some of your substitution strategies.
Yeah. I think one thing I've read about soccer is the team that runs the fastest towards the end of the game usually wins the games. I think that was a research I read a while ago when I was at Fairleigh Dickinson, I believe, because we use Polar with them, and we did everything you're talking about. With that position specific stuff. Defenders, midfielders, our wingers were a little bit different. Our forwards, distance covered, heart rate was huge. We knew after a conditioning session who's pretty much in shape to play the game, sport soccer, and who's not prepared for full 90 minutes. So I think that goes deeper than. I think it goes deeper with the sport of soccer, with the tracking, especially when you add the heart rate component to it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, anytime you can track, internal load, via heart rate, that always enhances the interpretation of the data. And if you're looking at a sport like, rugby, Australian rules football, and American football, you look at, the linemen where they're engaged and they're actually doing really hard isometric work. Sometimes the heart rate gives you a better indication, but really for those athletes, they're trying to work on some more technology, to look at what's occurring with some of the, gyroscopes and accelerometers, and overlaying that with the video to try to come up with some perhaps better metrics for the linemen. But I think the relative perceived exertion for some of those drills for interior linemen and rugby might be more accurate for those periods. I can add that RPE to those particular sessions.
Yeah. Ted, what do you think, like when it comes to doing all this stuff, when do you think coaches should draw the line where, all right, now you're starting to look at too much data and not doing anything with it? Like if you have a tracking monitor, do you go ahead and, look at a heart rate? If you're looking at heart rate, do you go ahead and look at resting heart rate? If you're doing that, do you go ahead and add another technology component, to kind of tie everything together? Or do you just stick with one thing and try to master it?
I would, you start off with the basics and then you could add. I think with the inclusion of heart rate, internal load, though, to me, that gives you a better indication, though, of maybe health and safety factors, because there are some algorithms you can use with sequential heart rate data to estimate core body temperature.
Okay.
So I can look at that, not only from a performance standpoint, but from a health and safety standpoint as well. Resting heart rate, college students, I'm not sure when the ideal time is to get that. It's because one, they're scheduled, they arrive to the facility, they have meetings, you're trying to figure out, when am I going to get to resting heart rate? Right. Conceivably, you could do it during positional meetings. They're sitting in a room, resting, have them strapped up, and then just walk down the hallway and, and let that populate in the software. But a lot of it is you've got a lot of administrative constraints. Yeah. The other things that will give you some data points that might be inaccurate would be, kid throws down a Red Bull before getting on his way from class to get to the facility. Yeah. And so am I looking at a training effect, or am I looking at the effect of, caffeine?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors, if the kid's dehydrated, so if the kid's dehydrated, if let's just say he's got a drop in plasma volume drops. That means your stroke volume probably drops. That means your heart rate has to go up to keep your cardiac output the same.
Yeah.
So am I looking at, he's overtrained, or is he just dehydrated?
Ah, okay. And you start to add those little wellness questionnaires. You think those always serve a good purpose or no?
I think they serve a good purpose, but if you ask players, what do you hate doing? Oh, I hate filling out these things every freaking day. And so am I getting an answer that they want, they think they want me to have, or am I getting the right answer? Because I've seen teams that, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being you feel great, where are you? Kid's honest, he puts a 2. And then the coach goes, why the hell are you a 2 today? So you think he's going to be honest the next time?
Yeah. And next day he'll put an 8 next time. We'll meet you halfway a little bit.
If you look at areas that, are you going to have high compliance? Are you getting good information? I mean, I would go 48 hours after a game and 48 hours before a game.
Okay.
I mean, you might have some sports, if you got a highly compliant athlete that says, I want to do this every day, that's great. But I sort of look at like the bell-shaped curve of your team. And, you got to do what's, realistic. And I don't want to turn these guys into having to do a lot of extra stuff, although I think it could be of value. But I just look at, are we getting compliance?
Yeah. So what trends have you seen over the years, Ted, from like when you first started tracking to like this present time today?
I think there's a lot more technology. I think it's the messaging of it. Like to your point, are we just collecting data to collect it, or do we actually have our coaches engaged with the stuff we're gathering? And to me, so much of that is communication. And there's the old statement that communication is the oxygen of relationships. Mm-hmm. And I've seen people hired that are really bright people, but they may not have the best people skills.
Yep.
And it's a disaster.
Yeah.
and sort of like little things. Any term I use, if I'm talking with a coach, I try to use terms that they're using with their athletes. So if I got an old school basketball coach, and I'm going to say, hey, we're looking at your accels and decels. He goes, what the hell's that?
Yeah.
I'll just say I'll label them stop and goes.
Gotcha. Okay. Talk their language a little bit.
Talk their language.
Yeah.
So I want them to feel comfortable. Because the one thing is, if somebody's really a brilliant coach, older, successful, try to take their terminology and apply it to what you're doing.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to, I don't want to have a glossary of terms I have to hand them when I'm talking about what the data we collect.
Yeah, you make the transition a little bit easier so you don't have to explain, right? Just get right to the point of whatnot. It's pretty good, man.
Because it was Albert Einstein that said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough.
Now, you know what? I can't explain anything simply, but I guess I don't understand much myself. Nah, but hey, Ted, man, this has been great, man. Very great, in-depth detail. And I loved it. Every point you touched on, man, from going back to, when you first started coaching and how you guys did it then to, what are you guys looking at now? And I know there's no one, key number outside of, player load that everyone should focus on, because everyone's got their own, I guess, mindset on, what KPI or, IMA that they're looking for that they value as much. I would say my last question to you is, what data points do you value the most when looking at this stuff?
I think the one area that people don't take into account as much, I'm big on what was the duration of the practice.
Okay.
And then, you look at the distance per minute, and then I look at, the different speed zones. Mm-hmm. And then I look at total accels and decels. Because some of them, sometimes when they look too deep into, the accelerations, well, that was a high-end acceleration. I just look at it from some position group. Let's just say you're a linebacker, you step up, you step back, you step up. I don't know how much you really, accelerated, decelerated. I know that's very fatiguing, though. So I just look at, a lot of those accels, decels, or some people might say there's, IMAs. Because I think those cumulatively have an effect.
I guess you could start individualizing your, I guess, training when you're running guys. Like, hey, our defensive guys are going to do something a little bit different than our offensive guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
because these guys play backwards, half the time, looking at the offense. Offense is playing forward 99% of the time besides the O-line, but it gets interesting. And I could talk about this stuff maybe for a long time. I don't know. There's just so much to dig into. I'm sure you found some stuff over the years that, you were like, this is brand new.
Yeah, I think, when you look at wide receivers, I think the guys that are great decelerators are really good receivers.
Good route runners, right?
Yes.
Get in and out of those breaks.
You got to get in and out. So when they go, how fast is he? You go, well, he's a great route runner. So I think, you'll be able to, as more data becomes available, you can start looking at deceleration profiles of different routes. And I think that stuff, that stuff's, but you got to communicate with the position coach to say, hey, what does so-and-so do well and what do they need to improve upon?
Yeah. Awesome, man. That's good stuff, Ted. Appreciate everything, all the knowledge you brought forth today, man. If anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
By email is it's T_ and then Lambrinidis, which is LAMBRINIDES @yahoo.com.
Perfect, Ted. Appreciate it, man. And one last wild card question I got to ask you, Ted. If you weren't doing what you're doing now, or if you haven't done any of this, throughout your career, what other career would you envision yourself doing?
I would, I guess I guess you could look at any type of challenge, whether it be a business challenge. But, I get great, I could just see, coaching high school.
Yeah.
Sports. So
any type of sport.
Yeah. I think I find great enjoyment with, watching people, improve as a person as well as athletically.
Yeah, that's cool. You struck me as like a forensic science type of guy for some reason. I don't know why. I thought you'd be out there solving murder cases. It's like, man,
no.
Ted's got a 100% conversion rating on fingerprint testing and finding the right suspects, man. But
that's right. That'd be great.
Yeah. Hey, Ted, any last words for our listeners?
I think the big thing is to try to talk to people that have been doing it for a number of years and finding out where they've made mistakes. Ask questions. Everybody makes mistakes. Just try to find out the different mistakes that have been made so you don't repeat those and waste time.